Okay, we have the basic movement of Mario, and the when it collides with the mushroom moves to a new place. But now what we'd like to do is add a score and add a timer. So let's start by doing. We need to add a label here and a label here. This one will be for I don't know, score or time, and this one will be for the other score or time. But let's start out by going to the table arrangement, and I want to add some columns. It's just to make things a little bit more pleasing to the eye. And what we're going to have to do now is move these over because everything was set to the left. So notice we have a column here that we're not using. That's the second column, third column, fourth, and the fifth that we're not using. So we're going to drag a label into here and a label into there. So let's come back up to our user interface and grab a label and bring it down. And right there. And then the other label, which we'll bring down. And it's right there. These labels we're going to rename. And the first one we're going to rename label, we'll call that one the timer. Label timer. And then the second one will be label score. Rename label score. And both of these are going to have a font size of 35, a height of 40, and a width of 150. So I'll do the same thing for the other label, font of 35, a height of 40, and a width of 150. Oops. 150. Okay, so if we come down here and then the text, let's just go ahead and change this. That's the timer. So I'll have it say timer to begin with, but as soon as we start using it, we're going to tell it to say something else. And the other one we'll call that score. But again, as soon as we start doing something, it's going to show up. And since this one is justified left, I'm going to put this one aligned to the right, kind of balance things out a little bit there. And let's see, we need to add a clock. That is in our sensors clock. And if you drop it anywhere, because it is a non-visible component. So we've added the labels, we added the clock, and we're going to add one more thing. We're going to add a reset button. Now I'm going to put this on the top. Let's start by doing a horizontal arrangement and put that on the top, and then drag a button in there. And of course, we're going to call this not just button 1, but button reset. Yep. And let's go ahead with a font size of 40, and we'll go with a height of 50 and a width of, let's call it, 125. That sounds good. And then the text is just going to say reset. It'll always say reset. We're not going to change it based on anything. All right, go ahead and get that and hook it up and make sure you've got this showing up on your interface, and then we'll get right to the blocks. Okay, the blocks. We have this move left, move right, move up and down, screen 1 initialize, and the collision going on. What we need to do next is change we need to add a couple of variables. So let's start out with initializing one for time and one for clock. So I'm going to call this timer. And we'll initialize to 0. Whoops, it is 0. So, and then we're going to add another one that's going to be called score. And we'll initialize that to 0. So when we initialize the screen, we're just going to go ahead and quickly set both of those to a better number. The score will stay at 0. That's a good starting score. Timers probably shouldn't start at 0, so I'm going to suggest that we start it at 10 And I did that. I wanted to see down here. I have this later one we're going to do later. We won't use it on this video. Is a third thing called freeze. And we're going to use it at the end of the game when we want to freeze the score so you can't keep scoring after the timer's gone. But right now we'll just sit with those. And so what we're doing is we're starting that. But when we set the score and set the timer to those, remember we have to set the labels as well. Otherwise, the score will change in the computer. You just won't be able to see it anywhere. So let me get back over here. I couldn't find my labels, and they're right there. Okay, so when we set the score or the timer to those there, we also need to set the text. And what we're going to do is set something. We're going to do this text thing that's a join, and we're going to take the since we're working on timer, we're going to say that the time. I'm going to put a colon, and real important to put a space here so the number doesn't crowd in. And then we're going to put that, we're going to join that with the value that's being held as the timer. So when we set the timer to 10, we're going to set the label called timer to time colon 10 in this case. All right. And then we're going to do a very similar thing for the score. I'm not going to say time, of course. I'm going to say score, colon, space, and then we will use the score variable. All right. Go ahead and well, I was going to say check that out, but that only works when you first initialize. But we're going to do a very, very similar thing. We're going to do the same thing every time that we hit the reset button. So why don't we go ahead and get that code in here right now. When the button reset is clicked, we're going to do everything the same. There, we're going to set Mario to a random place. We're going to set Mushroom to a random place. We're going to set the score to 0, reframe the score on the label, set the time to 10, and do that as well. So we now have those two events working correctly. The last thing I want to work on is the clock. And I guess what I'm going to do is we'll talk about something here. I think when we dropped the clock in, I made a mistake over here. Yeah, I did. If we get to the clock component, either by clicking on the component in the non-visible part or clicking on the actual clock in the components column, see timer enabled? We don't want that right now. So if you remember from the timer app, that means that the clock will be ticking but not doing anything when it's not enabled. Enabled means it does do something. So let's go back over here and have it do something when it's enabled. All right, so let's pull up the clock component. When the clock ticks, we want to set the score. I'm going to set the time variable to time -1, right, to the current time -1. And remember, this is one of those incremental. This is an incremental going down, but the incremental means things change by some fixed increment. And what that means in this case, and usually it's by a 1 or by a 5 or 10, but it's almost always by a 1. So the new timer variable, remember how we looked at this? The number that's being stored in this red folder is the number that used to be in there -1 every time the clock ticks. But that doesn't happen, you don't see that until the timer is enabled. And right now, as we put it over here, it's not enabled. So we need to figure out when we're going to enable it. And I'm going to say that we're going to do that right when we press one of these buttons, because the screen's going to initialize or it's going to be reset. And when we reset or initialize, randomly these two come out there, but they're not moving. Okay, so you start the game by moving Mario. Let's just do it with the up button, because I like doing it with the up button, and the way it's positioned, it's easier to work with. And watch carefully what we're doing here. Okay, we're going to say that the clock, if the clock is enabled, actually, let me start out with an if then. It's not an if then else, it's just an if then. And I'm going to put it right here. If the clock is enabled, and remember, it's not now. So we go to the clock component here. We scroll down to the green, and we get a block that fits in here. If the clock timer is enabled, then I'm sorry, I have to rephrase this. If the clock timer enabled is set to false, which it is right now, and let's go, false is in the logic here. If the clock enable is set to false, then we want to change it to setting it to true. So we're going to come back to the clock and do one of these set, not the get, but the set the timer enabled to true. And you can either come over here and grab a true, or you can just duplicate the false, and false is one. Oh, I duplicated the whole thing. Duplicate the false, and this is one that has a drop down. So we're going to do 2. So let me put that in here, and then we'll kind of go over what this is again. When you click the up button, we're going to move Mario up by 20. Remember, the negative 20 is going up in Y. And if the clock timer is false, we're going to set it to true. That means the second we touch the button, we're turning the timer on. Okay? Now, if the timer is already on, it doesn't do this. It just does nothing. But if the timer is off, the second we touch an up button, it's going to turn on. And what happens when you turn the timer on? Well, every time it ticks, we're going to change the timer to timer -1. And then we need to set the timer label to the new value. Okay? So let's take the timer label, and we're going to take the text here and set it to the new global timer. All right, review one more time. Button up, we move Mario up 20 pixels, and then we check to see if the clock is turned off, we turn it on. If the clock is turned on, we don't do anything, we leave it on. Okay, so if the clock is turned off, we turn it on, and as soon as we turn it on, every second it ticks, we take off 1 second on the timer, and then we change the text in the label to reflect that. The last thing I'm going to show you to do is to take this if-then block, duplicate it, put it on the button left, put it on the button right, and put it on the button down. I will do one of those, and you'll do the rest of them on your own. We're going to duplicate that and pop it right in there. So it's not just when you touch the up button. If you touch down button and when you get it done right or left, they will all result in the timer being enabled.